Right now, a 90 billion euro power struggle is shaking the core of Europe. Giorgia Meloni just did something no EU leader has dared to do in years. She publicly defied Brussels and refused to back down. This wasn't quiet diplomacy, this was a direct challenge to authority. And what happened next didn't just shock the European Commission, it exposed a deeper battle over who really controls Europe. You're about to see why this changes everything. October 2022 did not look like the beginning of a political explosion. It looked like another transition of power in Europe. Rome, Palazzo Chigi, Giorgia Meloni stepped into office as Prime Minister of Italy, leading the third largest economy in the Eurozone and a founding member of the European Union. The cameras flashed, statements were measured, Brussels watched carefully, but calmly, at least at first, because Meloni did not arrive quietly. From the very beginning, her government signaled a different direction: tighter border controls, open resistance to mandatory EU migration redistribution quotas, and pushback against elements of the Green Deal that she warned could devastate Italian industry and agriculture. And something even more provocative: a refusal to treat the European Commission as the final authority over Italy's domestic decisions. For months, the tension stayed below the surface. Meetings continued, statements were softened, words were chosen carefully. Ursula von der Leyen, President of the European Commission, had no interest in escalating into a direct conflict with a G7 leader. And Meloni, despite her firm stance, understood the stakes. Italy depended on EU recovery funds. The relationship had to hold. But beneath that fragile calm, something was building. Quietly, consistently, relentlessly. Brussels began sending signals, not loud at first, subtle warnings through official channels, carefully placed messages in allied media. Italy's policies, they suggested, were approaching dangerous territory: migration, budget discipline, and rule of law compliance. The tone shifted from concern to pressure, then from pressure to threat. And then came the moment everything changed. The European Commission floated something that had only been used in extreme cases before: Article 7, the mechanism designed to punish member states for serious breaches. The same tool used against Hungary and Poland. The nuclear option of EU politics. The message to Rome was unmistakable: fall in line or face consequences. Brussels expected hesitation, a pause, a negotiation behind closed doors. That's how this always worked. Pressure applied, compliance follows. But this time, it didn't. Instead of retreating, Giorgia Meloni stepped forward. Not privately, not quietly, but publicly and directly. Standing in front of cameras, she delivered a message that cut through the entire European system. She made it clear that the threat of sanctions was not just political pressure. It was, in her words, constitutionally offensive to Italian sovereignty. And then she said the line that sent shockwaves across Brussels. She had not been elected to implement the agenda of the European Commission. She had been elected to govern Italy. No diplomatic filter, no softening, no ambiguity. In that moment, something shifted. Because this wasn't just defiance, it was a reframing of power itself. Meloni wasn't arguing over policy anymore. She was questioning legitimacy. Who really holds authority in Europe? The elected leaders of nations or unelected institutions? And as that question echoed across the continent, Brussels realized something too late. This wasn't a negotiation anymore. It was a confrontation. And it was only just beginning. That confrontation didn't erupt out of nowhere. It had been building for 2 years, hidden behind policy debates and diplomatic language. But the real battle was never just about migration quotas or environmental rules. It was about control, and more importantly, leverage. Because behind every political warning from Brussels sat something far more powerful than words: money. Italy was not just another EU member. It was one of the largest recipients of European funds. Under the Recovery and Resilience Facility, Rome was allocated over 90 billion euros, the largest national share in the entire program. That money came with conditions, milestones, benchmarks, and oversight. And with those conditions came influence. In theory, it was cooperation. In practice, it was pressure. The system worked simply. Funds moved when governments aligned, and delays appeared when they didn't. It was never said directly. It didn't have to be. Everyone understood the rules, but Meloni understood them too. From the moment she took office, she didn't reject the system. She studied it, mapped it, and then started weakening its grip. Her government accelerated reforms, documented compliance, and removed excuses that could justify funding delays. Step by step, she reduced Brussels' ability to use money as leverage without exposing itself. By the time the sanction threat arrived, something had changed. The financial weapon wasn't as sharp anymore. That's when Brussels escalated. If money couldn't force compliance, reputation might. Article 7 wasn't just a legal mechanism, it was a signal to investors, to markets, and to political allies. It said one thing clearly: this country is out of line. But here's where the second miscalculation happened. Italy was not Hungary. It was not Poland. It wasn't on the edge of the system. It was at its core. A founding member, a pillar of European identity. Targeting Italy didn't isolate a problem. It risked exposing a fracture. And Meloni saw that immediately. Because at the same time Brussels was escalating pressure, her position at home was strengthening. Her coalition held firm. Her approval remained solid. And internationally, she had begun opening alternative channels, engagements that signaled Italy was not dependent on Brussels alone. So when the pressure came, it didn't land on weakness, it landed on strength. And instead of containing the situation, it triggered something unexpected: support. Not always public, not always loud, but real. Leaders across Europe, some cautious, some silent, began signaling agreement. Concerns about Commission overreach surfaced in Parliament. Statements were carefully worded, but the direction was clear. Meloni had said what others were thinking. Inside the Commission, the reaction shifted rapidly. Fury at the challenge, alarm at the consequences, because the strategy had backfired. Instead of isolating Italy, it had created a rallying point. And behind all of this was something even deeper. The system Brussels was trying to defend wasn't written in treaties. It lived in influence, relationships, financial dependencies, and institutional habits built over decades. And Meloni had just done something no one expected. She didn't just resist it, she exposed it. Now the question wasn't whether the system could pressure her, it was whether the system could survive being challenged this openly. And that is where everything becomes impossible to ignore. What happens next doesn't stay between Rome and Brussels, it spreads fast. Because this confrontation touches the one thing holding the European Union together: balance. The EU was built on a promise: shared power where it works, national control where it matters. But that balance has been shifting for years, slowly tilting towards centralized authority. And now, for the first time in a long time, that shift is being pushed back in full view of the world. And if Brussels moves forward with sanctions, the consequences are immediate. Not just political tension, but structural damage. Targeting Italy risks shaking investor confidence, destabilizing internal alliances, and triggering reactions from other governments already uneasy about Commission power. It doesn't isolate a problem, it multiplies it. If Brussels backs down, the message is just as powerful. Enforcement mechanisms lose credibility. The idea that pressure guarantees compliance disappears, and every leader watching, from Warsaw to The Hague, learns the same lesson: resistance works. That's the domino effect, and it's already in motion. Because this moment is not happening in isolation. Europe is under pressure from every direction: a war on its eastern border with no clear end, a shifting relationship with Washington that is less predictable than ever, and a global economic landscape changing faster than institutions can adapt. In that environment, internal conflict is not just dangerous, it's destabilizing. Every week spent fighting internally weakens Europe externally. Every escalation between Rome and Brussels sends signals far beyond the continent, signals that Europe is divided, signals that its institutions are struggling to maintain cohesion. And Giorgia Meloni understands this perfectly. Her argument is not framed as anti-European, it's framed as a defense of the system's legitimacy. She's not rejecting Europe, she's redefining it, saying that without democratic authority, the entire structure loses its foundation. That message resonates, not just in Italy, but across the continent. Public trust in European institutions has been declining. Energy crises, migration pressures, regulatory tensions, each one has chipped away at confidence. And when trust weakens, enforcement becomes riskier. Because pressure without legitimacy doesn't restore control, it accelerates resistance. That's the trap Brussels now faces. Push forward and risk fragmentation, or step back and risk losing authority. There is no easy path out, and Meloni knows it. She's not rushing, she's not retreating, she's holding position, forcing the system to respond on her terms, which means this isn't ending soon. This is the beginning of a much larger shift, a shift in how power is defined inside Europe, a shift in who gets to decide, and a shift that could redraw the internal map of the European Union for years to come. Because the real question is no longer whether Giorgia Meloni will stand her ground, she already has. The real question is how many others are watching and preparing to do the same. What nobody in Brussels will say out loud is that this confrontation is approaching a breaking point, not because of a single decision, but because of accumulated pressure that has nowhere left to go. The system that once absorbed conflicts quietly is now being forced to process them in public. And public pressure behaves very differently. It doesn't fade, it builds. At the center of this pressure is a simple reality that both sides understand, but neither can openly admit. The European Commission cannot afford to look weak, but it also cannot afford to escalate too far against a country like Italy without triggering consequences it cannot control. That contradiction is where the danger lives. Because if the Commission moves forward with formal mechanisms, it crosses a line that cannot easily be uncrossed. The invocation of enforcement tools against a founding member, like Italy, doesn't just send a warning, it creates a precedent. And precedents in the European Union tend to expand. What begins as a targeted action becomes a reference point for future conflicts. That's how systems evolve, but it's also how they destabilize. Meloni understands that dynamic. Her strategy has not been reactive. It has been calculated to push the system toward that uncomfortable edge, where every move Brussels makes becomes more costly than the last. She is forcing a choice, not immediately, not dramatically, but steadily. Either the Commission asserts its authority at the risk of fracturing internal unity, or it restrains itself and accepts a visible limitation of its power. And the longer this standoff continues, the more that pressure spreads beyond Italy. Because other governments are not just observing, they are analyzing. They are watching how far Brussels is willing to go. They are measuring the political cost of resistance versus compliance. And most importantly, they are evaluating whether the balance of power inside the EU is beginning to shift. That's the part of the story that remains largely invisible to the public. This is not just a dispute between two leaders, it is a live test of the European system itself. A test of how authority is exercised, how legitimacy is maintained, and how far institutions can stretch before they begin to lose cohesion. Inside national governments, conversations are happening quietly, not dramatic declarations, not public alignments, but careful discussions about future positioning. If the Commission succeeds in forcing Italy to adjust course, it reinforces the existing structure. But if it fails, if Meloni holds firm without meaningful consequences, it changes the calculation for everyone else. Because power inside the European Union has always depended on perception as much as enforcement. The belief that Brussels can act decisively has been as important as its actual ability to do so. If that belief weakens, even slightly, the entire system begins to operate differently. Decisions become harder to enforce, negotiations become more complex, authority becomes conditional, and once authority becomes conditional, it becomes negotiable. That is the long-term risk that sits beneath this confrontation, not an immediate collapse, not a sudden rupture, but a gradual transformation of how the European Union functions at its core. A shift from centralized enforcement to negotiated power, from assumed compliance to contested authority. Meloni's role in this is precise. She is not trying to dismantle the system outright. She is applying pressure at exactly the points where it is most sensitive: sovereignty, legitimacy, financial leverage, and public perception. Each of these elements reinforces the others, and together they create a feedback loop that amplifies every move in this conflict. Brussels, in turn, is navigating a narrowing path. It must respond, but carefully. It must signal strength, but avoid escalation that could spiral. It must defend its authority, but without exposing its limits. These are not easy calculations, and the margin for error is shrinking. What makes this moment different from previous EU conflicts is not just the scale, but the timing. The broader geopolitical environment is already unstable. External pressures are high, internal cohesion matters more than ever, and yet, at this exact moment, one of the Union's most influential members is openly challenging the structure that holds it together. That's why this isn't just another political dispute, it's a stress test under real conditions. And stress tests don't just reveal strengths, they reveal weaknesses that were previously hidden. The outcome of this confrontation won't be decided in a single meeting or a single announcement. It will unfold over time, through signals, reactions, and adjustments on both sides, but the direction is already clear. The balance inside the European Union is being renegotiated in real time, and once that process begins, it doesn't simply reverse. Drop a comment telling me who you think really controls Europe right now. Hit that like button if this opened your eyes to what is really happening, and subscribe, because this story is not over, not even close.